In our podcast, Hearing the Unheard Stories of Transformation, we discuss a variety of sensitive subjects such as suicide, suicidal ideation, self harm, abuse, and faith crisis. Viewer discretion is advised. Hi, welcome to our podcast, Hearing the Unheard Stories of Transformation, presented by Pause Wellness. I'm your host, Eric Stauffer, and we welcome our regular guest with us, Jill Dickey. Hi, Jill.
Hi, brother. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I always love talking to you, so I'm excited about our topic today.
I got to meet your grand puppy yesterday.
He's the cutest little guy.
Fitz. What breed is he? Havanese?
He's a Havanese, the national dog of Cuba.
Well, they're like this big.
Yeah, he's tiny. He's like the size of a guinea pig, but cuter.
Yeah,
No offense to guinea pig owners out there.
very cute, and could be his own. He could be like the Paws Wellness mascot, because
Yeah.
just total relief of depression and anxiety by just being by that dog.
Yeah, his little face. Although I don't know about the anxiety part. He's kind of a Tasmanian devil at
True, he
this
creates his
age.
own anxiety.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But
the
he's so
anxiety in his
cute.
owners.
I'm glad you
Yeah,
got to meet him.
yeah, so
Yeah.
fun. So, what are we going to be talking about today, Jill?
Okay, I think that we discussed before kind of what our topic was going to be today, and we're going to continue working or discussing the four skills of differentiation.
Right.
And for those of you who don't know what we're talking about right now, I highly recommend you go backwards and listen to Eric and I's episode on differentiation, and then you'll understand this. But one of the skills that we can develop to become a more differentiated person is to gain a stronger sense of self, a healthy, strong core sense of self. And so today, you and I are going to explore that aspect of differentiation. Last time we explored emotional regulation in that piece. And today we're going to really explore sense of self. And I think we're going to need more than one episode to do this because this is
Yeah.
a really deep and rich topic with lots of parts to it.
Yeah, and lots of great skill sets and resources to help us with this. So, when we're talking about sense of self, are we talking about self-esteem? Are we talking about confidence? What do you, if we were to just kind of start with that first idea, what do you mean by sense of self?
I think self-esteem is definitely a part of sense of self. That's a kind of a buzzword from the 80s. We heard that all the time. Do you have a healthy self-esteem? And self-esteem in my head kind of means just do you esteem yourself as good or valuable? And so that is definitely a part of sense of self. But I think just really understanding core sense of self and how to develop a strong, healthy connection to your core self is more, it's deeper than just self-esteem, although self-esteem is part of it.
Right. Yeah, that's great. So, I think I sometimes in some arenas have a good sense of self, and in other arenas not so much. Um, is that typical, or is it an overall general level of healthy sense of self versus not?
I think that's a good question. And I think it is normal to be more solid about who you are in certain contexts and then a little shaky in other contexts. And that's just part of the developmental process of, building a stronger core self. So I don't think it's abnormal in any way, but I do think that once you kind of grasp what having a good, solid core sense of self is and how to develop one, you can kind of stabilize in whatever context you're in.
Mm.
And so,
So as you're working with your patients at your practice, um, how do you know when you need to work with someone on sense of self? What are you seeing as a
mm,
therapist?
I mean, sometimes they're really explicit about it. They come in and say, one of my goals for therapy is to build better self-esteem. That's usually how they say it. So like, I don't have very good sense of self, or I don't have very strong self-esteem, or I just always feel bad about myself and I really want to work on that. I don't like that feeling. And so some people will be really explicit about it and other people not so much, but you can it kind of comes up in the conversation and you can tell that they're really struggling in this area of development and for good reason. Okay. And what I think is great about what you're just asking is because before we get into this, I want to make something explicit and clear about this. And I think that it's really important to understand that if you are suffering from a clinical mental health challenge, such as like depressive disorder or generalized anxiety disorder or obsessive compulsive disorder, if you have significant trauma in your life, such as abuse, maybe if you've experienced abuse of any kind, or if you're struggling with addiction or compulsive behaviors, there's a lot more that I could say, but if you are struggling with some of these things, I really encourage you to get support and help from a professional who knows and is trained in working with these things directly, because your sense of self is very much in, like, your worth is very much intact. That's not something you can ever change, but your ability to feel that and to really be able to access that healthy sense of self and that core value is a little bit challenging when you're dealing with some of these things, and you might need extra support.
It's kind of what we've said maybe in an earlier episode where name the last time you felt the spirit when you stubbed your toe. Um, so if you're dealing with some of these more severe diagnoses or compulsions, behaviors, addictions, it's going to be hard to feel a healthy sense of self until you learn how to manage those
Mhm.
things. Not that you don't have, like you say, not that your self-worth or your sense of self is bad in general, but
Well,
yeah, you
that's
got
not
to
a
learn to
possible thing. Everyone's
cope.
precious to their core, right? But
That's
our
right.
ability to access the feeling of that can be compromised by some of these things that I mentioned. And it's not, you can get it back and regain access to that feeling, but it can take more time, and you might need some professional
Yeah.
support in your journey to do that. So I just wanted to say that before we embark on this topic.
Amen. That's great.
Okay. All right. So there is a phrase written on the Temple of Apollo in Delphi. Do you know what it is? It's famous.
Is it know thyself?
You
No, I
got
don't
it.
know.
How did you
Did
know that?
that was a total guess. I just guessed.
Do you win at Trivia Pursuit?
I apparently do. I really did just guess that.
That was
Know
amazing.
thyself.
It's
I
know
have seen
thyself.
that like inscription so in an ancient way, so I just figured maybe that was it.
Yeah, that's what it is. So
Hmm.
bravo, 5 stars. Know
Nice.
thyself is what is written on the Temple of Apollo. And it's a beautiful phrase, but it's easier said than done. So we're going to kind of pick this apart and see if we can get a clear understanding of what it is to know yourself. So I came up with a good definition that I think works, and then you can tell me what you think about it. Okay, so here's
Okay.
my definition, and it's kind of a few parts. This is my good like my definition of what having a strong sense of self is. So having a strong sense of self is about knowing and embracing who you truly are, independent of external influences or the need for validation from others. It's about being grounded in your own values, beliefs, and desires and living authentically according to them. That's a mouthful. Let me add to it. Okay. And then you can,
Yeah, go ahead.
developing a strong sense of self is a lifelong journey. Building a strong sense of self requires self-reflection and intentional action. Okay, that's a lot. What do you think?
I love it. I The more I've learned about this just in my own experiences, the more I've realized I used to think that strong sense of self would be just confidence and but I think that I often included confidence as taking all the dark parts of me or the parts of me that I was ashamed of and just hiding them deep enough
Mhm.
to to fool everyone into thinking that I didn't have those flaws in my life. And the more I tried to run from them, the more difficult they became, or the more dark they became, scary.
More
The
difficult it
monster.
became to keep a lid on them, to keep them down.
Yeah, not even that, not even just like secretness, but just um like there's a pain deep inside that I felt like I had to hide from for myself.
Mm,
Not even just public awareness of it, just like,
even from you.
okay, I'm going to turn my eyes from this because it's just too
Mm,
scary for me.
yeah.
And the more I've learned about sense of self, the more I've learned, hey, I need to know that I need to realize that that is a part of me,
Hmm.
and that having more grace and compassion for the person that I was that experienced those things actually makes me stronger. And and I can love myself more, and that's a truer sense of self than oh, I can cope with that, I can handle that in kind of
Hmm.
like machismo kind of way.
Hmm.
um and so that's that's kind of been my own personal journey with sense of self. So the way that you phrased all of that, I just related so much with it.
That's so great. And
Yeah.
thanks for sharing that because I mean, I can certainly relate to doing that and having that kind of an experience myself. And I think a lot of people will relate to you because this is a way a lot of us build a sense of self or project a sense of self or have a certain persona out in the world, you know,
Yeah.
in earlier stages of development.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
it's really
And
common.
sometimes I mean, I could see where that could have driven me to a much more introvert lifestyle.
Mm,
um and I'm not just talking about shyness, I'm just talking about, well, if I'm, I just, the more I'm involved with people, the more relationships I have, the more there's a chance for them to discover my weaknesses
hmm.
or
Hmm.
the flaws that I have. And so I might as well just not engage, right?
Hmm.
So there, it's almost like sometimes you just don't want to get out of bed because,
Hmm.
yeah, I mean,
Well, you're
that gets a
talking
little
about
bit dark.
something we discussed earlier because differentiation to become a more differentiated person is this wonderful way to develop because if you are more fully differentiated, meaning you understand yourself because that's part of the differentiation process, and you know yourself better and you're more integrated and more comfortable with both the dark and the light parts of yourself, right? Then the more you're able to stay in connection with other people and the more you can have an intimate relationship with others. And what by intimate I mean close. You can know and
Yes.
be known by others. And when we don't know ourselves well, or there's things that we've not integrated or we haven't looked at or we're scared to look at, or we're scared that other people won't like us because of them, then we will avoid
Yeah.
relationships and we will avoid depth of relationship, whether we're extroverted or introverted.
Yeah.
As people will avoid depth of relationship because we're not comfortable with what's in there.
Yeah, exactly. It's almost like a false concept of oneness is that oneness is sameness. And where diversity can be oneness as well.
Sure.
And oftentimes we're talking about, when we talk about diversity, we're talking about different cultures or people or backgrounds or something like that. But
Hmm.
I feel like it, it's it's great to develop a diversity of oneself, so that these diverse aspects of who I am are the oneness of who I am,
That's true.
and
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 that's what
that's okay.
we're gonna talk about. And you go deep real fast, bro. You are like a philosophical guy. Like you just because we are gonna talk about that. I think that's gonna be our next episode because this is
Okay.
gonna take too long to do in one episode, but we're gonna talk about getting to know the shadow self.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you more what that is if you haven't heard that term before, and we'll really discuss it. It'll be a fun discussion, and I think people will learn a lot. But that will be our next one. I want to get it just kind of normalize some of the
Yeah.
things you're saying and talk about the developmental process of a sense of self. Because I think sometimes when we understand how we build this, we don't feel so bad if we're not there yet.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool. Walk us through it.
Let's do it. Okay, so maybe some of you will hear some of these terms and maybe not, but let's see. Okay. In the early stages of development, okay, and this is not necessarily an age thing, right? There's some people who are younger who have moved through some of these higher stages of development, and there's some people who are older who have not, but that doesn't mean anything about the person other than just this is their journey and their time frame. But in earlier stages of development, a sense of self is more of what psychologists call reflected sense of self,
Mhm.
meaning that we start to develop a sense of self by seeing ourselves through the eyes of others. In other words, I am who I am in your eyes. Okay. And
So
this is
is it almost like other people are our mirrors?
yeah,
So
that's
how
why
we
it's
see
called
people
yeah.
respond to us, right?
I'm
Okay.
developing a sense of self by how other people are interacting with me, what they're saying, what they're expecting, how they respond to me. And I'm taking
See,
cues from the outside world and I'm building a sense of self around that. I mean, just think about, I mean, this stage lasts a long time, right? I
yeah.
ever go to like a junior high to like one of
Oh
your
yeah.
kids' events and you just sit back and watch the kids at a junior
Oh,
high
it just
kind of
makes me sick to
interacting.
my stomach because I remember those days. Like,
Well, I just
and
think it's interesting to watch them because I know these developmental stages,
yeah,
these human developmental stages, and they're just right where they should be developmentally, where every little move they make, they're paying attention to how other people are responding to them, and they're hyper aware of what everybody else thinks and how they get reacted to, and it's just so interesting to watch.
and the thing that's so sad about that, Jill, and I'm sure you'll address this, but is that we're so bad at our assessment of what they are reflecting.
Mhm,
It's so far off from the reality of who we are because we're so bad at reading people. Sometimes we're really good or hypersensitive to it, but still we the fact that we draw those conclusions, I watch my youngest right now and what he's going through as he's gathering his reflected sense of self, and he's so far off
mhm.
from what the reality is, and it's heartbreaking because
It
it's
is.
just so painful what he's drawing the conclusion, but it's his reality.
Mhm.
It's truly what he feels that people feel about him.
Well, and I'll tweak it a little bit. I do think we're good at reading people, but we're not very good at maybe making the proper conclusions as far as our
Right.
worth is concerned. And the reality is like, you're a young kid and you're in junior high and sometimes people don't like you
Yeah.
and they don't respond well to you. And we can tell that, but the meaning we make about that, about
Yeah.
our value is really the problem. And
That's a greater clarification of what, yeah,
Mhm,
that's really what I mean. Not so much like we're bad at reading people, but what we then conclude that means about us is
mhm.
so far off,
Yeah, we're
especially
not
when we're
we're not
younger.
good in the with the meaning of other people's
Yeah.
behaviors. It means so much about us when people aren't acting well. We don't know how to make it be about them. We make it
Yeah.
about us and our inadequacies. And again, it's pretty normal when you're younger
Yeah.
to be impacted by that more, which takes us to the opposite of reflected sense of self in higher stages of development. The opposite of reflected sense of self is a solid sense of self, which is what we're going to be talking about building. And that is, I know who I am no matter what is going on around me. And this is more difficult to develop. It takes more maturity and understanding and wisdom about yourself and about the world and about how people operate.
Yeah.
And so it's challenging for younger people sometimes. And it can be, you're really lucky if even, maybe junior high is really tough for you, or high school is a hard place to be, or maybe you're early in your college education years and this is tougher. And you're lucky if you've got people that you can go home to and they reflect your worth back to you. That can be really helpful. Not everybody has that at
Not
home.
everybody has that,
Mhm.
and that's what's so sad.
And that's where, we've talked about in earlier podcast episodes that, if you are a believer in a higher power, in some sort of divinity, and you have a correct understanding of that divinity, it
Right.
can be a good place to find, to plug into a source of your value and worth that's really solid and good.
Yeah.
My understanding of God is that he loves everyone all the same, and we're all deeply, deeply valuable and precious, and that you can't change that.
Yeah.
And that's just a beautiful thing to know. I mean, sometimes I'm able to access that and other times no, but I know it's
Yeah.
somewhere in me. That reminds me of you and I were just in an event together, and you probably
Right.
know what I'm going to talk about.
Yeah.
There was a really fun speaker there. Maybe some of you are familiar with Alex Boyer, but he was there and he was talking about some of the work he does with high school kids who are dealing with suicidal ideation and suicidality and depression. And he commits a lot of his time and energy to working with kids with that. And he did a little demonstration where he brought out a $10 bill. I think he got it out of your wallet.
He did.
and he's like, okay, do you guys all want this $10 bill? And we're like, yeah. And then he kind of crumpled it up and spit on it and stomped on it. And I remember his little kids in the back laughing while he was stomping on it,
Yeah.
and crushing it. And then he kind of opened up this crumpled, dirty $10 bill and he said, hey, do you still want this? And everyone in the room's like, yeah, it's still worth $10. And they kind of made the point that that's true about us, that no matter what happens to us, we can't change our bottom line value.
Yeah.
So, I don't know, what are some thoughts of yours on that?
Yeah, I love that illustration. And I, the great thing is when we think of value with ourselves, um, even just like with the $10 bill, the potential of that $10 bill and what that $10 bill can empower someone to do. And so when we remove value um, in error, we also remove the potential. We remove the momentum and the intention that that person can bring to their life and to other people's lives.
Yeah.
And
And that's
so
why this
what a
work is so good, right?
yes, that's
Hmm.
exactly what I was going to say. Like it's so crucial that we remind individuals of that innate worth, whether
Hmm.
that's from the spiritual side of things or not, just the human experience.
Yeah. And hopefully we approach people with that in our minds
Yes.
and the way we
And
treat them.
ourselves.
And ourselves. Yeah. And it's not always easy to do because of the circumstances of life. It makes it challenging sometimes. But that's why it's worth spending some time thinking about this and dedicating some of your time to really understanding this so that you can have more of it and
Yes.
access more of that value that's already there. So I want to talk a little bit about what we kind of do, because I think it can be helpful to kind of think about, okay, here's what we're doing in lower stages of development to try to stabilize a sense of self when we're not quite sure what it is. And it can be good to know what some of the things that we do are, because then we can track it in ourselves. Oh, see, I'm doing this. I'm 50 years old and I talk about this stuff all the time and I still struggle with these things. But because I have the vocabulary for it, I can recognize it in myself and say, oh, I'm doing that. I'm doing that. Maybe I can think about that for a second and really consider what I'm doing and how I'm trying to stabilize here.
Yeah.
And so do you mind if we
Uh,
kind of go through that?
totally. The vocabulary thing, I think we've talked about that in earlier podcasts, but the more words we give our brain within which to operate and understand,
Mhm.
the more flexibility we have and grace we can give ourselves. So give me some
Yeah,
more.
when you can name things, you can work
Yep.
with them. Okay.
Yeah, it's like
So,
diagnosis is half the battle, right?
yes. So these first three, I'm going to use a bunch of A words. This will help you remember. So if you have a paper and a pencil and you're taking notes, you could write these down. But these are the A words. I use these with clients when we're talking about sense of self.
Okay, awesome.
There's an A word. See, you're good. You're good at this.
Yeah.
Okay, the first three I'm getting from a therapist that I really respect the work of, and this is he works with couples and relationships. His name is Terry Rill, and he's out of Boston. He works out of Boston, but he talks about reflected sense of self in very specific ways, and he'll say, okay, when I struggle with who I am, and I'm struggling with that solid sense of self, I'll try to get a sense of who I am through three ways, right? The first one he says is achievement. I have worth because of what I accomplish and what I do. So, like, oh, I have worth because I have a degree from Harvard, or I have worth because I'm on the basketball team. I have worth because all my kids went on a mission. Okay, something like that.
Right,
I achieved that, gold standard of something. So I have worth because of what I do. Now I want to be careful with this one because again, it's okay to accomplish. I'm
right,
not saying stop accomplishing, but I'm saying stop hooking your value to that.
right.
Anything you want to say about that one?
Yeah, well, uh, such a temptation in our culture where we live, where it seems like, and maybe social media makes this really uh, an easier temptation because we can broadcast our accomplishments
Yes.
and then we get reactions based upon those accomplishments, thus reinforcing this impression that our self-worth is dependent
Mhm.
upon what we accomplish.
Yep.
So it just creates that vicious
I
cycle.
I think social media actually exacerbates all of these
Yeah. Yeah.
that we're going to talk about. And this one, yes, for sure. Um, and again, it's okay to get recognition for the things you do. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with it, but if we need that in order to feel okay, then we might be in some troubled water.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it feels good. It's going to feel
Mhm,
good to
sure.
everyone,
And
to
I'm
those who
I'm
have a
all for
perfect sense of self and who
developing
don't.
capacity, right?
Right.
Please do, but it's your worth isn't tied to it.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, I see that you agree with me there.
I agree.
Okay.
That agree. Another A word.
Okay, and that's actually one of the A words, which is hilarious. Okay, so the next one is attribute self-esteem or self-worth. I have worth because of what I have or own. So if I have a fancy sports car or a big fat bank account or the bikini body,
I have the bikini body.
well, I didn't want to say because I don't want
So
your
like
worth to be about that,
that's
but
true. I mean, it just is convenient that I have
yeah,
that. But what
exactly.
about like could attributes be individuals, like people, like in our
Yeah.
life?
I have worth because I'm really smart.
Hmm.
I have worth because I'm funny.
Could it be I have worth because I'm married to who I'm married to?
Yeah,
That's an attribute.
sure.
That's something I know that I have felt because I feel so thankful I'm married to Emily.
Hmm.
I'm feeling down, the sense of
Hmm.
self. And then she's expressed the same thing.
Hmm.
Like, I'm feeling down about myself, but I'm married to this person.
Mm.
And maybe that can be a great comfort, but also not if our self-worth is dependent upon that.
Yeah, I was like, well, I don't, I'm not that valuable except, I'm married to Eric, so that makes me valuable. That's
Yeah.
that's what I'm talking
And then when
about.
I
Okay.
fail, right? If I fail, if I do something wrong, then
Yeah.
what happens to her sense of self if it's
Right. And
so attached to my
there's nothing
success?
wrong with being happy that you're married to Emily. She's a great
Right.
person and there's a lot of great things to be happy about because you're married to her.
Right.
But yeah, you're right. Like, what if you don't stay up on your pedestal?
That's right.
Hmm. So these are
And
all shaky ways of stabilizing a sense of self because they're not things you can control and
yeah.
always guarantee, right? That's what makes them tricky and not as stable as like an inner sense of self. And that, that's not that easy to do this, but that's why we're talking about some of these other ways so we can kind of pay attention. So the third A of externally sourced sense of self is affiliation. I have worth because when you're talking about this, I have worth because of who I'm connected to. I have the right friends at school. I know some really cool people in high up places.
who I'm related to.
People really think I'm great. I have, 40,000 followers on Instagram,
Right.
so that makes my value, that's makes it stable.
So what were the three again? So
So
accomplishments, attributes, achievements.
achievement-based esteem, attribute-based esteem, and affiliation-based esteem. Now, again, I'm
Okay.
just going to keep re-emphasizing this. There's nothing wrong with these things. But if that's how we're stabilizing a sense of self, we might be on shaky ground because these things can go away and we don't really have control over those things.
Did you
And
say outsourcing? Like these
yeah,
the
so
outsourced sense of
yeah,
self?
like I'm shaky about who I am, but man, I'll get that sports car and then I'll be cool. And
Yeah.
yeah, so those are
I
kind of the
like
things
that
we
that
learn.
visualization of outsourcing our sense of self.
Hmm.
We can see why
Hmm.
that's flawed. It's a flawed reasoning.
Hmm. And little kids outsource their sense of self all the time, but they need to in a way because in their stage of development, they need to do that a little bit. But as we're maturing, we want to be more aware of this and say, I wonder if this is a good idea for long-term stability, inner
So
stability.
you're so like a baby that's looking to their parents for safety, security, and
Hmm.
love. Uh, so they're gathering that sense of self from because it's the only way they know how to
That's the
get
only
that
way. Yeah, that's the
reflection
way
in
they
their
have.
parents.
Yes, it's like, oh, this person cares about me, so I must matter. Right? This is okay when you're young, really young, and you're developing a sense of who you are. this
Right.
is all very normal, but we're talking about people in later stages of the development where this doesn't work for us so much anymore and we're struggling.
So the parents, a wise parent would realize that my goal is to help them transition to autonomy as it pertains to sense of self.
Yeah.
I mean sometimes I mean it's almost like the principle of Munchausen syndrome, like Munchausen's by proxy. Like I'm going to get my sense of self by knowing that I am providing you your sense of self
Mhm.
as a
Well, parents
child.
struggle with this a lot. This is why this is
Yeah,
important too. To outsource your sense of self to your children is not
yeah,
the best idea because then they don't have their own lives without destabilizing you.
yeah,
So this can
exactly.
get
So
tricky, right?
living
Like,
living my high school days by proxy through my child,
yeah, well,
kind of
my
a thing.
attribute, maybe this is an attribute self-esteem thing where it's like, or an achievement. Okay.
Yes.
I've achieved perfect children. You know, my attribute is that I have all these really good kids that never do anything wrong. That's not, then those
Well,
kids don't get to live their own life, you
and
know?
we watch so many people, including myself, when one of those children that the trajectory seemed like it was going so well, and then they have some life decision or life circumstance that doesn't fit that mold of what we had prepared for them, and
Hmm.
then we kind of have this breakdown like, oh no, what did I do wrong, what did they do wrong?
And then
And
where's your
then
sense of
all we're
self?
doing is, yeah, we're getting rid of their sense of self by saying that there's something they should be panicking about
Theirs and maybe
because
yours
we're panicking
because
about it.
yours is in the toilet because you don't feel
Right.
good about yourself now, right?
Yeah, we're all when we have that reaction as parents, all we're telling our children is they should be worried about it too because I'm worried about it.
Hmm. And again, easier said than done because
Sure.
we invest a lot in our children because we want to do well by them, but sometimes our sense of self gets in there in ways that aren't good for either us or them. So
Right.
that's why we're talking about this.
Yep.
Okay, so the next set of A words, because also in lower stages of development around sense of self, our inner stability is often dependent on these four A words, okay? Attention, getting approval, reassurance or assurance, and agreement. We're really focused on those things. And again, attention's not necessarily bad, approval's fine, assurance is good, agreement's nice. They're okay, they're neutral, but when our sense of self is shaky, then our ability to function well as a person gets a little bit shaky because what if we aren't getting attention?
Someone should look into the word history of the prefix of the word of the letter A, because how in the world do we have these many concepts and characteristics
Oh, I think
in
people
the
just got
same
creative.
level of
Yeah,
science?
maybe. I don't
It's
know.
and I mean that like intentionally, like, okay, so approval, attention, what were the other two?
Attention, approval, assurance, and agreement.
Yeah,
Yeah. So I
man,
don't know if it has anything to do with the letter A, but someone got really creative
it
about
probably does.
noticing what people need. I got those
That
four
prefix.
words, the four A words there from a book called, I think we talked about this in the differentiation podcast, Everything Isn't Terrible by
Yep,
Kathleen Smith. She
Kathleen Smith.
talks about just being aware of our dependence on these things. And, because what happens if, someone doesn't agree with us,
Mm.
you know? Because sometimes they
That's
might
why
not.
it's just I'm a little uncomfortable because I'm realizing how much I love those four things.
Mhm. Oh, we all love them.
Which we all do, I'm
I like
sure.
them.
But I wonder how often I've developed my sense of self based upon I'm just going to be around people who agree with me.
Well, probably often because in lower levels of development, that's what we do, and it's pretty normal, right? We're just becoming more aware. So, yes, I love it when people agree with me. I like when people give me assurance and approval and attention. I like all of those things, and it's okay. There's nothing wrong with you if you like those things, and I hope you get lots of them. But the challenge is, okay, but what if someone's not assuring me, or I don't have their approval? And trying to get their approval means I have to compromise who I am and what my values are to get that approval. Then I might need a little work on sense of self there because that's really destabilizing to me if I have to kind of be different than somebody.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. Otherwise, we're just creating you know, a, I mean, if we're just surrounding ourselves by people who agree with us, how much more growth can we get?
Hmm.
It's like the concept of magnanimity, right? Where like
Hmm.
Abraham Lincoln, maybe we've talked about this before, but Abraham Lincoln, where he developed this cabinet of dissenting voices so that he could learn more from just having creating an echo chamber of approval of all of his own
Yeah.
thoughts.
Well, if you think about this, you think, oh, what's the inner mechanism that allowed him to do this, to be this kind of person, right?
Yeah.
And my guess is that he had to have a pretty solid sense of self somewhere in there,
Yeah.
some maturity around that. Um, I'm going to complicate this even a little more. There might be, okay, let's say, my sense of self is a little shaky and I need approval. So I might bend and shape myself in ways that aren't really integrity based to try to get it. That could look like extreme people pleasing,
Oh
not
yeah.
being true to myself. Or if I can't get that approval, then it's just like, well, fine. I don't care. I don't
They're
care what
or
anybody says.
they're a terrible person because they don't
Yeah.
approve of me.
Yeah. And I can't tolerate those terrible people, right?
Yeah.
And you have to be kind of in rebellion of that because you don't have that approval.
Fight or
And in
flight
either
mode tends to
extreme,
kick in.
hmm in either extreme,
Sorry.
we're kind of unbalanced there. And so having that
Yeah.
healthy sense of self that's more inner and more stable inside, you can navigate those things a little easier. Remember, differentiation is navigating connection and the way we're all deeply connected to each other and need that, and autonomy, becoming true to yourself and who you really are. And that's challenging.
Yeah.
So,
Comfortable in your own
mhm,
skin.
yes. So, when our sense of self is more stable, we can function from a stronger, calmer center, even if we're not getting attention, approval, agreement, all of those things.
Mhm.
And that's what we want to work towards. Okay, you ready to talk about another way that we can track struggles with sense of self?
Does it start with A?
It doesn't. I feel
Oh,
like I'm going to disappoint you now because it
that's
doesn't.
okay.
I'm trying to stretch my brain to figure out how to make it start with A. Maybe
I'll
you can
come up
figure
with. I'll be the
it
thesaurus here. Here we go.
out. Okay, see if we can do it. Okay. All right. So when our sense of self isn't stable, it can be tempting to occupy one of two positions. The first one is when I'm feeling a little dysregulated about who I am when I'm in connection to you, in order to kind of organize myself or put myself back together, kind of stabilize my sense of self, I have to go into a one-up position to you. I have to feel better than you and kind of psychologically feel like I'm better than you in order for me to feel okay.
I got it. I got the thesaurus word.
What is it?
Authoritative position,
Maybe it could
like
be.
kind of dominant, one
It
up,
might be something
above,
that you
above. There's a word that starts with
above.
an A. Above,
Hey, there you go. You have to put yourself above
above, one up.
people. It's like, oh, I'm feeling kind of shaky down there. And people who kind of do the one up, sometimes they're not quite as in touch with like their feelings of lower self-worth, but it really is at the core of having to feel like you have to be better than others in order to be okay, right? And then there's another, and this one's more obvious. And, we think of like someone in therapy is more doing, going to therapy for this, but oh man, whenever I'm feeling shaky, I just know that I'm not as good as.
So
I
that's the
just
one
know that
down.
I'm less valuable, less important, I matter less than you. And I know that sounds kind of strange that that's how we would kind of put ourselves back together, but that's what we do. It's like this is how I stabilize is I have to feel worse then.
So
Hmm.
they're both trying to do the same thing, just in different directions.
Hmm. And some
Is
people
that
just
right?
tend, yeah, and they're well, yes. And some people are just more, they gravitate more towards that one up position, and some people gravitate more towards the one down position. But the interesting thing there is that they're both distortions of reality.
Right. So if I'm in the one up position, I'm going to put myself there and then have things evidence to me that I'm correct. And if
Hmm.
I'm in the one down position, I'm going to put myself down. I'm going to have others prove to me that I'm not, so
Hmm.
that I'm regulating based upon
Hmm. See,
external
I'm right.
evidence. It's
See, I'm
more
right.
outsourcing, right?
Yeah. See, I'm right about myself. I'm just
Yeah.
worse than most people.
Yeah.
That's clear, you know? And both of them are distortions of truth because what's true, Eric?
The truth is we all have flaws and we all have strengths.
Hmm. Are we better than or worse than others?
No.
No.
No, that goes
What's our core
against
value?
the core value of humanity.
It's the same, right? It's all
Right.
same. We all are that $10 bill.
Right.
And so if we're feeling like we're better than people and we kind of have to be there to feel okay, or we're down in the, worm's eye view of the world, like I'm just never as good as, we can just be sure that those are distortions of reality.
Okay, so let me ask you a question. This is maybe an
Mhm.
extreme conclusion, but is this what leads to um, criminal behavior? Like in an extreme case, maybe they're so one down that they're like, I'm just going to embrace this and endorse this dark side of me so much that I don't care what anybody else thinks, and I'm going to go. I don't know. Maybe that's too much psychology, but
I mean, there's a lot of factors there. There could be
right.
personality disorders and, like all kinds of things there. So that's pretty hard to answer. But yes, I mean, let's take it less extreme. Let's say, okay, I have a really one down way of orienting myself to the world. And so, yeah, I kind of just don't care. And I feel so bad about myself anyway that I'm just going to do things that make me feel worse about myself. And I don't, that's what I deserve. And of course, I'm going to make those kind of mistakes because I'm just worthless. It can be part of it, but it can also be a one up thing. I'm better than people. I'm above needing to pay attention to how I impact people because, I'm better than you.
Yeah.
And, I want to make a distinction between capacity and value. So, maybe some of you listening are like, but there are people who are better than me at things. Like, what do you mean? Like in there, I'm better than some people at things. Does that make me better? What do you think about that?
Well, um I think it's different, right? So uh Michael Jordan is better than me at basketball, but that doesn't mean, and he makes quite a bit more money than I do. But does that mean that he has more self-worth than I do?
No.
And I can't think that way, because if I did, there's a lot of Michael Jordans in the world,
Hmm.
and that could leave me feeling destitute and of no value at all.
Hmm.
So
Well,
I
and
have to recognize where my worth is, not
mhm.
based upon income or basketball prowess.
Yeah, well, and Michael Jordan is quite removed from you in real life. What if it's just your friend at school,
Yeah.
right? That's harder. Or your
Yeah,
neighbor,
exactly.
or someone in your church
A colleague,
congregation,
yeah, a
or yeah,
colleague or someone
at
of my
work.
socioeconomic status,
Yeah.
same skill set. If I'm jealous of other religious educators,
Mhm.
that can cause some problems.
Yeah. And so, that is the reality of things. There are people who are better at things than we are. No matter what you're good at, there's probably somebody better, and somebody worse at that thing. And capacity is fine. Build capacity. I've said this before, like go crazy, build
Right.
capacity. But I don't care how much capacity you get. I don't care if you're Michael Jordan at basketball. That doesn't change your core value and doesn't make it any different from that kid who's been in a wheelchair his whole life and has never shot a basketball.
Right. See, and
Mhm.
this is what makes me upset, Jill, is sometimes when we see other people increasing their capacity and we're intimidated by that, we want to we want to cast stones and saying that they're not doing it for increasing capacity, they're doing it for these other reasons, right?
Well, they
This
might be.
which they might be, but if I'm doing that because I'm intimidated by their increase of capacity,
Well,
that's
I like meaning I've got to cut them down to size in some way
right.
so that I
Or
don't
I
feel
got to
so
say, oh,
small.
they're doing that because they want attention, or they're doing that because they want recognition. All those A words that we talked about.
Well, and they
So
might be.
we're quick to cast the stone of
Hmm.
other people doing that, when in reality, what we've just done is we've put ourselves in the one down position, and we're
Hmm.
using those same tactics.
Hmm. Which again, you know, it's it's common, it's normal, it's
Yeah.
human to do that. I find myself doing that quite frequently, like, oh, I feel kind of insecure about that. Well, she's not so great, you know,
Yeah.
or because I'd like the one-up position more.
Like when
That's
I'm
my
beating you in cards, you just have a
no,
tendency to,
I just stopped playing because I
yeah.
but
Is abort one of the A words because you just abort the game?
abort. Well, that's what that is one strategy you could use. It's like, well, I'm going to stop trying, just abort this whole mission
That's
because I
right.
can't,
I'm out.
yeah. And so anyway, there's lots of ways that we could discuss this, but I like the framework of kind of like, I'm noticing that I'm kind of having to be in this one up position to feel okay, or like, oh, I'm spending a lot of time down in that one down. What do I need to look at or think through or get support with? Depression, a lot of depression is a lot of one down thoughts
Yep.
that we spend a lot of time thinking about, which causes feelings of one down and lack of value and worth. And it can be hard to struggle down there. And so if you're feeling like that, it can be great to go get support and do what you can to work with those thoughts and feelings, at least as part of it, part of your treatment for that.
Yeah.
So there's lots of ways we can go with that, but that's another framework that I like, is that one up and one down idea
Yeah.
to be kind of tracking. So this kind of will conclude part one of
Yeah.
this, is, just kind of ways of thinking about ways that you're outsourcing a sense of self, or ways that you can notice that sense of self needs some consideration and some thought and maybe some reflection. Um,
And
because
maybe you
those,
can just outline for us where we would go
yeah,
next, like
that's
for the
that's what I'll
next two
do. So our
episodes.
next session, I think it would be great to talk about session. I'm talking like a therapist. Our next podcast.
Our next
Um,
lesson,
next
speaking like an
lesson.
educator.
Yeah, you're a lesson. Now, our next lesson
Yeah.
will be, so building, a solid sense of self requires knowing who you are, yeah, and a willingness to know who you aren't yet. Okay, so that means we've got to, we're works in progress, and if we're going to grow and develop and build that more solid core sense of self, we need to be willing to look at our limitations and weaknesses, things that we still need to look at, things that we haven't become yet, maybe some weaknesses that are holding us back. And we need to be able to do that without that one down shame.
Yeah.
And that's not easy to do.
Yeah.
So we've got to get kind of a good view of like, yeah, these are my strengths and I think I'm doing well here and I can continue with that. But here's some places I need to look. And that was what you were saying earlier about, hey, I've got these parts of me that I don't really want to look at and I don't really want to put them forward because I'm worried that if I see these things or if other people see these things, I'm not going to be okay.
Yeah. It's
And
so interesting. We sometimes I'll have like a question of the day with my students, and I'll ask a question like, "Hey, what what is something you really love about yourself?" And man, they squirm
do they?
because they just don't feel like they can say that publicly because of their fear of the arrogance or the pride that they think that
Do you think it's
represents.
because they have a hard time finding things they like, or that they're just afraid to say it?
Probably both. Some one, some the other. And
Hmm.
then you could ask them the other, like, hey, admit to something that you are not great at. And it's a similar squirm.
Hmm.
It's some are like, hey, I don't want anyone to know that I have these flaws. And some are like, just uh, you know, afraid of the negativity, or I it's interesting. Just the honesty, the self-diagnosis and the honesty is so hard for us.
Hmm.
And for what I'm gathering from our first this podcast today is we've got to get more comfortable with that,
Hmm.
with recognizing who we are, because the correct self-assessment and honesty and diagnosis of ourselves will help us to know how we can go forward with a healthy, differentiated sense of self.
Yep, it's true. And so I think you're going to like part two of this discussion. It's going to be a good one. It'll be more philosophical for you, which I know you're going to
Nice.
like. And, I'm going to probably make you squirm a little bit.
Bring it. I'm not afraid of you.
And we're gonna do some self-disclosing to help people understand this. Okay. So I think it's gonna be fun though.
That'll be great.
Yeah. Anything else you want to add to this part one?
No, I think that's so good. I appreciate you, Jill, and your expertise. And as we wrestle through these things, I hope our listeners are able to recognize and be honest with themselves as they look at these things, because knowledge is power, right? It
Yeah.
really, really is. The more we understand these things, the more we can live in a healthy way.
Yeah. And we're all learning together
Yep,
in this human soup that we live in. That's
that's
so
right.
great. Yeah.
Human soup.
Human soup.
That's great. Okay,
Okay.
thanks, Jill.
I'll see you
Well,
next time.
yep, sounds good. We'll see you.
Okay.
Bye.
Great. Bye.